The wind cut like glass across the frozen Alaskan tundra, and the world had shrunk to white, merciless nothing. I remember the way my boots crunched through the crusted snow, every step echoing in the empty morning like a warning. That's when I saw him, tiny, trembling, pressed against the shadow of an old truck, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The air around him was thick with frost, each breath a visible struggle, each shiver a heartbeat counting down to something I couldn't yet name. His fur was matted, clinging to him like ice, and for a moment I thought I was seeing a ghost, so small, so fragile, almost invisible against the cold that threatened to swallow him whole. I crouched slowly and he flinched, a soft whine escaping his frozen lips. In that silence under a sky the color of steel, I realized the story had already begun, long before I arrived. A story of abandonment, of survival against a world too harsh, and of a connection that neither of us yet understood. The wind tore across the snow-covered field like a living thing, carrying with it the sharp sting of ice that settled deep into bones. The sky above was a steel gray, heavy with clouds that promised more snow, more cold, more silence. Every step I took left a hollow crunch, breaking the stillness, yet it felt as if the world itself had frozen in place, waiting. And then I saw him, a tiny shadow curled beneath the rusting frame of an abandoned truck, barely more than a trembling lump of fur. He was impossibly small, a mere ghost against the vast white landscape, yet his presence shouted in the quiet. His eyes, wide and fearful, met mine for a heartbeat. And in that moment I understood everything he had endured. He was alone, completely, terrifyingly alone. The air around him shimmered with frost, each of his shallow breaths forming delicate clouds that disappeared almost instantly into the wind. I knelt slowly, feeling the bite of snow against my knees through my thick pants, my hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of what I was witnessing. Every shiver that racked his tiny body was a wordless plea, a confession of pain, fear, and a hope that somehow someone would notice before it was too late. The ground beneath the truck was uneven, a mixture of frozen mud and hard-packed snow, and the faint smell of oil and rust clung to the metal. The puppy's fur was matted with ice crystals, clinging to him in little clumps that gleamed like tiny diamonds in the weak morning light. I could see the imprint of where he had curled up for warmth, the tiny patches of snow pressed into his coat like memories of each cold, lonely night. The wind gusted again, whistling around the truck, and his small body trembled violently. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't want to scare him. Didn't want him to retreat further into his frozen shadows. My own breath came in clouds, and I could feel the ache in my chest. The helplessness that comes when someone's suffering is palpable, immediate, and beyond reason. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. I could hear the faint rattle of his tiny teeth, the whimper that rose and fell with each shiver. And then the snow beneath my hand crunched, and he flinched violently, curling in on himself as if trying to disappear entirely. I whispered his name softly, though I didn't know what it was yet, and tried again, letting the sound float through the frozen air like a fragile lifeline. Slowly, cautiously, he peeked out from under the truck, one paw stretching into the open, as though testing the world for danger. The way he moved, hesitant, uncertain, desperate, broke something inside me. This wasn't just cold. This was fear, hunger, abandonment. I knelt lower, letting my warmth seep into the snow between us, and began to talk to him softly without sudden movements. I imagined the nights he must have spent shivering, huddled in the shadow of whatever he could find, listening to the wind scream, and wondering if anyone would ever care. My hands, wrapped in thick gloves, hovered above him, the heat from my body radiating like a silent promise. Slowly, carefully, he stretched one paw toward me, then the other, testing the strange gravity of human warmth. And when he finally pressed his tiny nose against the glove of my hand, sniffing and trembling, something unspooled in my chest. A raw, ragged relief, the first thread of hope stitching itself into the frozen emptiness around us. The world didn't stop being harsh just because he had found me, and I couldn't let myself believe it would. But I could take the first step. I scooped him gently into my arms, feeling the delicate, fragile weight of his small body, and held him close, letting my jacket envelop him, letting the heat from my own chest seep into his frozen fur. His small heart hammered against mine, each beat echoing a story I didn't yet know. The snow fell around us, light at first, then heavier, a quiet shroud that wrapped the world in white. I tightened my hold, whispering reassurances into the cold that seemed to reach even deeper than the wind. We moved slowly, carefully, away from the truck, each step a negotiation with the ice beneath our feet, each movement a promise that we were both going to survive this. And yet, even in the midst of that fragile connection, the cold pressed against us like a living thing. My breath fogged the air, mingling with his tiny puffs of air, and I realized how close we had come to losing him completely. The world was indifferent. Alaska didn't care if he lived or died. But I did. And that knowledge, sharp, immediate, and impossible to ignore, burned through me, igniting a determination I had never felt before. I would not let this story end here, in frozen shadows beneath a rusting truck. I would not let him fade into the white. We trudged slowly toward the faint outline of a nearby cabin, each step leaving prints that might as well have been our declarations. We existed, together, against the wind, against the cold, against everything that had brought us here. And as we moved, I watched him settle slightly against me, the tremors in his body slowing, the first real signs of trust beginning to show. For a fleeting moment, his eyes closed, and I felt the weight of that trust press against my chest, a tiny, fragile heartbeat, promising survival if only I could match it with my own resolve. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale gold glow over the ice-crusted world, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to imagine warmth, not just the physical warmth we were seeking, but the warmth of being seen, of being cared for, of being pulled from the brink of nothingness. It was not a rescue yet, not truly, but it was the first step. And sometimes the first step is all that matters. The cabin was small, weathered by decades of storms, its wood gray and pitted, corners worn smooth by ice and wind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soot and cedar, the remnants of long extinguished fires lingering in the corners like ghosts. I set the puppy down gently on the cold wooden floor, feeling him tremble against the thin warmth of my jacket. He hesitated, small paws scraping lightly against the uneven boards, ears flattening each time a gust of wind rattled the window panes. I could see the fragility of his trust etched in every careful movement, the hesitation of a creature who had known only abandonment and danger. I knelt beside him, letting my hands hover just above his back, waiting for him to accept the touch. When his tiny body finally leaned into me, it was as though the world had shifted just slightly on its axis, a subtle realignment that whispered, maybe, just maybe, he could survive. Outside, the storm had grown sharper. Snow pressed against the cabin walls and drifts that hissed and scraped as the wind danced around them, turning each sound into something primal and threatening. But inside, there was a fragile pocket of stillness, a temporary shelter from the fury of the frozen world beyond. I could feel the puppy's heartbeat under my palm, irregular and frantic at first, then gradually steadying as he realized that the hands that held him did not bite, did not shake, did not let go. I began to speak softly, telling him stories without words, filling the silence with warmth, human rhythm, and a promise I wasn't entirely sure I could keep. I found a small blanket folded in the corner, thin and worn, and wrapped him carefully, pressing him against my chest again. The heat from our combined bodies began to thaw the ice in his fur, droplets forming along the edges of his coat and soaking into the fabric beneath him. I could feel the tension slowly easing from his limbs, the tremors becoming less frantic, less desperate. For the first time since I had found him, there was a hint of relief in his eyes, a fragile trust that flickered like a candle in a windless room. I whispered encouragements, coaxing him to drink from a small bowl of water. I had melted from ice, careful not to force him, careful not to frighten him away. Every tentative sip, every tiny lick of water felt monumental, each a quiet victory in a world that had shown him nothing but indifference. I moved to the cabin's hearth, checking the fireplace for tinder, and the smell of smoke and charred brought a strange comfort, a memory of warmth I hadn't realized I was missing, too. The puppy followed me, small steps echoing on the wooden floor, and I could hear the soft pad of his nails, the gentle hiss of breath against the cold air of the room. I worked quickly, building a small fire, feeling the flames bloom slowly, their light dancing across his fur and highlighting the subtle changes, the way his eyes lingered on movement, the way his ears flicked at the sound of the crackling fire. He was cautious, always cautious, but not entirely afraid anymore. That was progress. Survival, in this frozen place, was measured in inches and heartbeats, not miles. Night fell with an almost brutal suddenness, the sky turning an endless dark blue, speckled with stars that were pale and distant, like eyes watching from another world. I wrapped the puppy in the blanket again, pressing him close to my chest, letting the fire warm our bodies. He rested his head on my arm, a soft sigh escaping him, and I realized I had not exhaled fully in hours. His warmth was no longer a threat, no longer foreign. I began to imagine the days ahead, the weeks, the months, even the lifetime I might share with him. But that imagination was tinged with fear, because the world outside had not changed. Alaska had not softened. The wind would continue to bite. The cold would continue to creep under doors and through broken windows. Survival was never guaranteed here, and every moment of warmth had to be earned. Sleep came slowly, not for me, but for him. His body relaxed only in the faintest sense, eyes closing for short periods before opening again, scanning, listening, trembling, relaxing, trembling. I stayed awake, hands resting on the blanket that wrapped him, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat. I thought of the nights he had spent under trucks, under porches, under the indifferent sky, and my chest tightened. Each memory I imagined for him, each small, imagined shiver, each sound of wind rattling metal overhead, was a testament to the fragility of his survival. And yet he had made it this far. He was still here. Small, trembling, vulnerable, but here. That was hope. That was enough for now. Morning arrived, not with a gentle sunrise, but with a blinding white glare through frost-covered windows. The puppy stirred, lifting his head and blinking against the light, and I could see the gradual recognition, the understanding that warmth and safety were not illusions, that hands could heal rather than harm. I brought him water and some food, watching as he ate with careful, deliberate movements, still wary but less fearful. Each bite seemed monumental, each swallow a testament to resilience. The sound of him eating filled the cabin in a way the wind never could. It was alive, it was persistent, it was real. And in that sound I heard something else too. The first threads of trust weaving between us, fragile but undeniable, delicate but unbroken. The day was long, the wind unrelenting outside, but inside we built routines, small rituals of survival. I checked his paws for frostbite, drying and warming them, rubbing his ears and tail, noticing each small improvement, each tiny victory. The fire never went out, and every crackle and pop became a punctuation in our shared story, a reminder that warmth existed, that survival was possible. And as I watched him curl against the blanket, head resting lightly on his own paws, I realized something profound. This was not just about rescuing him. This was about learning to survive together, to trust in small moments of connection, to build a fragile fortress against a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. The hours passed, slow and deliberate, and I could see the change unfolding in him. He was still cautious, still fearful of sudden movement or loud sounds, but he began to stretch, to explore, to test the boundaries of the cabin in my presence. Each cautious sniff, each tentative paw forward, was a heartbeat of courage. And with each heartbeat, I felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on my own shoulders. This small creature, abandoned and nearly lost, depended entirely on me now. I could not fail him. I would not fail him. Survival was no longer abstract. It was immediate, tangible, every breath, every step, every shared warmth of victory we earned together. By evening, he had begun to play small, clumsy motions that were almost imperceptible but undeniable. The trust that had been a fragile flicker in the morning now glimmered more steadily, a quiet flame in the dark. And I realized, as I watched him, that survival was not just the absence of death, but the presence of connection, of care, of the simple act of being seen. In the harshest environment I had ever known, I had found that connection, and in it, the first real hope of life. The puppy and I, two fragile beings in the vast, indifferent Alaskan wilderness, had begun to weave a story together. One breath, one heartbeat, one step at a time. And outside, the wind screamed as it always did, but inside, we were no longer alone. The snow had softened into a quiet drizzle by morning, tiny flakes falling lazily from a pale, bruised sky. The world outside the cabin looked almost gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the storm that had howled the day before. Yet beneath that fragile veneer of calm, the cold still lingered, seeping into corners, pooling along windowsills, and creeping under the cabin door. The puppy stirred at the edge of the blanket, small ears twitching, eyes wary but curious. He had eaten his fill and had begun exploring the cabin's modest interior, yet each movement was measured, cautious, as if the floor itself might betray him. I watched him closely, noting the subtle arch of his back, the way his tail dipped in hesitation, and I felt the weight of his history press against my chest. This was not a creature naive in the world. He had been abandoned, betrayed, left to navigate merciless cold, with nothing but instinct. And now, even with warmth, food, and shelter, he was still learning that trust could exist. I knelt beside him, letting my hand hover just above his head, giving him the choice to approach. The first time he had pressed against me, it had been desperation. Now the decision was cautious, deliberate, like testing whether my presence carried danger or safety. The flicker of recognition in his eyes was tempered by doubt, the kind that only those who have been hurt repeatedly carry in their gaze. I whispered softly, letting the words form more like a hum than a sentence, filling the space with warmth and patience. He inched closer, paw by paw, finally allowing me to stroke the fur along his shoulder. Each movement was a negotiation, a fragile agreement that this small, trembling creature was willing to make. And with that, a tiny thread of trust began to grow, fragile but unbroken, winding through the quiet cabin like an invisible lifeline. The morning stretched long, each hour marked by the slow creak of the cabin, the occasional tap of melting snow against the roof, and the steady hiss of the dwindling fire. I prepared a small dish of warm broth, careful to let it cool enough for him to drink. He approached it with tentative steps, ears flattened, nose quivering, before finally taking a careful sip, and then another. I watched, breath caught in my throat as the tension in his body eased slightly. Survival was a rhythm, I realized, measured in the small victories. The acceptance of warmth, the courage to eat, the willingness to breathe without fear. Outside, the wind moaned through the skeletal trees, carrying with it the cold bite of the world. But inside, we had carved a small sanctuary, a fragile bubble against the harshness beyond. Yet trust, I knew, could not be forced. I had to let him navigate the cabin at his own pace, testing the boundaries, discovering safety through trial. I moved slowly, carefully placing a small blanket near the fire, then stepping back to allow him the choice. He circled it, sniffed, pawed gently, then retreated slightly, unsure. I held my breath, giving him space, resisting the impulse to push him closer. This was delicate work, teaching a creature that had been abandoned to believe again, to believe that warmth could exist without threat. And as I watched him finally settle, curling his small body on the edge of the blanket, I felt the first real pulse of connection beyond desperation, a cautious, nascent trust that I would not betray him. Hours passed with the quiet cadence of patience. I kept moving gently around the cabin, preparing small meals, checking his paws for frostbite, and letting the fire crackle without interruption. Occasionally, he would glance at me, ears flicking, tail wagging in the faintest tremor of hope. Each glance, each tiny wag, was monumental, a silent agreement that this strange human, this presence in his life, might be something safe, something to hold on to. I spoke little, letting my movements communicate my intent. I would not harm him. I would not leave. I would not abandon him. Go. And slowly, imperceptibly, he began to mirror my motions, moving a little closer with each passing hour, testing the boundaries of trust with careful steps. By late afternoon, the storm outside had softened into a persistent drizzle, and the cabin felt warmer, safer, somehow alive with the fragile rhythm of survival. The puppy began exploring further, sniffing corners and climbing onto small furniture, testing each step with cautious bravery. He approached the fire, sniffing, then backing away, then approaching again. I knelt beside him, letting my hands rest lightly on the floor, encouraging his curiosity without forcing it. Each small movement of bravery was a heartbeat of trust, and I felt it echoing in my own chest, a delicate affirmation that our shared survival was no longer just a necessity. It was becoming a bond. Night arrived slowly, the sky darkening into a deep indigo, stars hidden behind clouds that promised another storm. I wrapped him carefully in the blanket once more, holding him against my chest. The warmth we shared was more than physical. It was the comfort of being seen, of being understood, of no longer being alone in a world that had shown him nothing but indifference. His small head rested against my arm, eyes half closed, and I marveled at how much had changed in so few days. The shivering, the fear, the desperate caution, each had softened just enough to allow a glimmer of hope to take root. And yet, beneath that hope, I sensed the fragility. Trust, once broken, could be shattered again in a single misstep, a loud noise, a sudden movement. I remained vigilant, moving carefully, speaking softly, letting him lead the pace of our shared story. He was learning, slowly but surely, that warmth could exist without threat, that human hands could heal instead of harm, that survival was not just the absence of death, but the presence of care. And with each small victory, the bond between us grew, delicate yet undeniable, a fragile lifeline connecting two beings against the indifference of the frozen world. By midnight, the puppy was asleep, curled tightly against my chest, breath slowing, tremors softened, eyes closed in an unguarded sliver of peace. I watched the fire, letting its glow fill the cabin, and realized that survival was not merely a physical act. It was emotional, psychological, spiritual. A negotiation with fear, a reclamation of trust, a quiet assertion that life, even in the harshest of conditions, could be tender, could be safe, could be worth fighting for. Outside, the wind whispered against the walls, carrying with it the relentless reminder of what had been lost, what had been endured, and what still lay ahead. Inside, however, the flicker of trust, the fragile pulse of hope, and the shared warmth of two survivors offered a glimpse of possibility that neither of us had known we could reach. And in that quiet night, I understood that the rescue had only truly begun. It was not enough to save a body from cold. I had to save the soul within it, nurture it back to trust, teach it to breathe without fear, and help it believe that warmth, love, and connection were real. And as I held him, small, fragile, and trembling, I promised silently that I would not fail him, that our story would continue, that survival was more than endurance. It was a bond growing stronger with every heartbeat, every cautious step, every breath shared between us in the fragile light of a fire against a world that had once turned its back. The next morning arrived with a strange clarity, as if the storm had washed the world and left it stark and raw, every detail visible in the pale light. The snow lay crisp and untouched outside, sparkling faintly like frost-encrusted glass, and the wind carried only a whisper of the previous day's fury. I watched the puppy stir at the edge of the blanket, small muscles tense, ears flicking, nostrils quivering as he catalogued every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light. He had grown bolder, yet caution remained etched into every gesture, every tilt of the head. His eyes, once wide with fear, now held something softer, something like curiosity, though it was still guarded. And in that guarded curiosity, I saw the first real sign of progress, the recognition that warmth could exist, that trust could be nurtured, and that life could extend beyond fear. I prepared a small breakfast, warm broth with morsels of soft food, watching him approach. His paws sank slightly into the uneven wooden floor, and I could see the faint traces of frost lingering between the pads, tiny reminders of what he had endured. He sniffed cautiously, then began eating, careful but determined, as though each bite was a victory over the memory of hunger and neglect. I moved around the cabin with quiet attentiveness, checking the fire, adjusting blankets, and allowing him the space to explore at his own pace. Each glance he cast my way, each tentative approach, was a heartbeat of connection. The snow outside, so bright and relentless, reminded me that the world beyond this small cabin remained harsh and unforgiving. Yet within its walls, survival and hope had begun to intertwine. By mid-morning, the puppy had begun to move more confidently, testing the boundaries of the cabin with careful steps. He climbed onto the windowsill, sniffing the cold glass, ears swiveling at every distant sound, the soft crack of ice underweight, the whistle of the wind through nearby trees, the faint rustle of branches against each other. His body still trembled, but the tremor had shifted from terror to energy, from fear to tentative curiosity. I knelt beside him, letting my hand hover above his back, and he allowed me to stroke the fur along his spine without hesitation. That simple gesture, the acceptance of touch without fear, felt monumental. It was the first true affirmation that the threads of trust we were weaving together were holding, fragile but resilient, delicate but undeniable. The afternoon brought a quiet lull. The fire crackled, casting golden light across the cabin, and the puppy curled into the blanket nearby, eyes half closed in a moment of comfort. I moved closer, feeling the warmth radiate from him, noticing the subtle changes, the way his tail twitched in contentment, the relaxed muscles in his shoulders, the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future beyond immediate survival. A future where he could feel safe, where he could play without fear, where he could trust without reservation. And as I watched him, I understood that survival was no longer merely physical. It was emotional. It was relational. It was the reclamation of a soul that had been abandoned and nearly lost to the cold. Outside, the wind had shifted slightly, less urgent but still present, rustling the skeletal trees and sending soft cascades of snow down from their branches. I could hear the faint echo of dripping water from melting snow, the soft hiss of moisture against frozen surfaces, a reminder that the world continued beyond our fragile sanctuary. And yet, in the cabin, there was a rhythm, a pulse of life that belonged to us alone. I began to speak softly, telling him stories without words, letting my voice flow like a gentle river over rocks, consistent, soothing, warm. He listened, ears flicking, eyes watching, and gradually, imperceptibly, he began to respond. Not with words, but with gestures, movements, and trust. The evening brought a breakthrough. I had left a small ball on the floor, a simple object meant to test curiosity and playfulness. At first, he sniffed it cautiously, circling it, pawing lightly before retreating. I didn't rush him, simply letting him explore at his own pace. Minutes passed, and finally, he nudged it with his nose, then with a paw, and then he chased it across the floor in a tentative game. Small leaps and clumsy turns that sent the ball skittering. Each movement was a victory, each leap a declaration that he was alive, present, and capable of joy. I watched, breathless, heart full, as the fear in his eyes softened, replaced by the faint glimmer of playfulness, of curiosity, of hope. In that small, clumsy game, I saw the transformation of survival into life, the evolution from fear to connection. Nightfall descended slowly. The sky a deep, inky blue streaked with the faintest silver light from the moon, and the wind whispered against the cabin walls, a quiet reminder of the world beyond. The puppy, exhausted from exploration and play, curled into my lap, tiny paws resting against my chest. His breathing was even, slow, and for the first time, I felt the weight of shared survival ease, replaced by something softer, something profound. Trust, I realized, was not built in hours or days. It was built in moments like this, small victories stitched together by patience, consistency, and care. And in that quiet night, I allowed myself to believe that our bond, fragile yet strong, could withstand the cold, the indifference, and whatever challenges lay ahead. Sleep came slowly, gently, for both of us. I held him close, feeling the subtle rise and fall of his chest against mine, listening to the tiny, steady beat of his heart. Outside, the world continued its harsh rhythm. The wind, the snow, the distant call of an unseen bird. But inside there was warmth, there was trust, there was the fragile miracle of survival and connection. And I understood in the depth of that night that hope was not merely an abstract concept. It was real. It was tangible. It was embodied in the small, trembling creature curled against me, in the shared warmth of our bodies, in the quiet pulse of life that defied the cold, the wind, and long history of abandonment. By morning, the puppy had grown bolder still. He explored the edges of the cabin, sniffing corners, climbing onto small furniture, and returning to me with each discovery as if to share his triumph. I responded with soft words, gentle touches, and consistent presence, reinforcing the threads of trust that had begun to take hold. And in those small interactions, I felt the profound truth of our survival together. It was not enough to rescue him from the cold. I had to nurture the warmth within him, restore the trust that had been shattered, and teach him, slowly, gently, that the world could contain care, connection, and safety. And as I watched him curl against the blanket near the fire, eyes half closed in tentative contentment, I realized that survival had become something more. It was not merely a struggle against the cold, nor a fight for life. It was a reclamation of trust, a weaving of hope from the fragile threads of shared experience, a quiet affirmation that even in the harshest wilderness, warmth, care, and love could endure. And in that fragile victory, I felt the first true pulse of what lay ahead, a bond that would carry us both through the cold, the fear, and the uncertainty, toward a future that neither of us knew. The morning broke quietly, the sky a pale wash of gold and silver, light glinting on snow so pure it almost hurt to look at it. The puppy stirred, small paws stretching, ears flicking at the sound of the wind outside. But there was something different today, an energy, a pulse. a sense that the fragile threads of trust we had been weaving were now strong enough to face the world beyond the cabin. I knelt beside him, letting my hands hover lightly above his back, feeling the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the tiny, steady beat of his heart. Each breath seemed to say, "I am alive. I will survive." And in that shared rhythm, I felt a surge of hope so potent it almost brought tears to my eyes. The world outside was still indifferent, still harsh, still unforgiving. But inside, within the fragile warmth of this small cabin, something had changed. He was no longer a creature merely surviving. He was beginning to live. We moved outside together, stepping carefully onto the crisp snow, the air sharp against our faces, carrying with it the tang of ice, pine, and frozen earth. The puppy's paws sank slightly into the untouched powder, leaving delicate imprints that told the story of his first tentative steps beyond the sanctuary of the cabin. He paused often, nose twitching, ears flicking at every sound. The distant crack of ice, the soft whistle of wind through the trees, the faint rustle of movement in the shadows. But he no longer flinched at my presence. He no longer hesitated when I reached toward him. Trust had begun to bloom in the cold, and in that bloom, I felt a profound, almost overwhelming sense of relief. He was not just surviving. He was beginning to believe. The day unfolded with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I led him to a small clearing where the snow was shallower, broken only by the tracks of wildlife and the faint shadows of trees. He explored cautiously at first, sniffing, pawing, circling, retreating, returning, testing the edges of his world like a scientist discovering gravity for the first time. Then gradually he began to run, small legs pumping against the white ears flopping, tail high, a soundless laughter of movement that carried through the frozen air. I watched, breathless, heart swelling with a mixture of pride and astonishment. This creature, abandoned and nearly lost, was reclaiming life in every bound, every leap, every tentative sprint across the snow. And as I followed him, careful to let him set the pace, I realized that rescue had transformed into something larger, something sacred. We were both learning to trust again, to find joy again, to survive not merely for existence, but for connection. But survival in this world was never simple, never guaranteed. The storm that had softened the day before returned unexpectedly, a harsh gust tearing across the clearing, snow swirling into biting clouds that stung eyes and froze skin. The puppy hesitated, ears back, tail low, body trembling, not from fear of me, but from the raw power of nature itself. I moved quickly, scooping him into my arms, holding him tight against the cold, and for the first time I felt the fragility of our triumph. One misstep, one exposure, and the warmth we had nurtured could be undone. I whispered softly into his fur, letting the sound of my voice anchor him. Let him know that even in the fury of the world he was not alone. The wind screamed around us, snow lashing against jackets, but in the small pocket of connection, we were impervious, if only for a moment. That night, back in the cabin, the fire roared with newfound intensity. Flames danced across the walls, reflecting in the puppy's eyes, now wide with fascination rather than fear. He circled the warmth, paws sinking slightly into the soft carpet of blankets I had laid, and finally settled into a small mound, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. I sat nearby, watching him, listening to the subtle rhythm of his existence, marveling at how far he had come in so few days. The tremors that had racked his tiny body beneath the truck were gone, replaced by a gentle energy, a quiet confidence that he could face the world, even one as merciless as Alaska. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Rescue is never simply about removing someone from danger. Rescue is about nurturing the courage to live, to trust, to move forward even when the world offers only indifference. The following days passed in a rhythm that balanced vigilance with gentle freedom. I let him explore the surrounding woods cautiously, always nearby, always ready to respond, but allowing him the dignity of discovery. He chased shadows, pawed at frozen puddles, and even began to playfully tumble in the snow, his joyous yips carrying over the hills and echoing in the still, frozen landscape. Each sound was a testament to resilience, a proof of life reclaimed. I would catch him mid-leap, brushing snow from his fur, whispering words of encouragement, letting the warmth between us grow stronger. Trust, once fractured, had healed, and now it radiated outward, a bond that neither of us could ignore or deny. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and rose, painting the snow in fiery hues, I knelt beside him on a hill overlooking the cabin. The puppy, now bold enough to rest his small head against my knee, looked out at the vast expanse, ears flicking, tail gently wagging. I ran my fingers through his fur, feeling the soft warmth that replaced frost, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine. And I realized that this journey had become more than survival. It had become transformation. In the harshest of conditions, we had found trust. In the face of abandonment, we had built connection. And in the coldest of winters, we had nurtured hope. And then, as if the universe wished to honor our fragile triumph, the sky shifted. A faint crack in the clouds allowed a beam of sunlight to fall across the snow, illuminating him in golden light. He lifted his head, eyes wide, shimmering in the glow, and for the first time I saw not a frightened, abandoned creature, but a living, breathing testament to survival, to resilience, to the transformative power of care. I whispered to him softly, words unnecessary but weighty with meaning, promising silently that he would never face the world alone again. The wind whispered around us, carrying away the remnants of fear, and in that single, luminous moment, I knew that everything had changed. The fire of hope we had nurtured together was no longer fragile. It burned steadily, a constant warmth against the frost of a harsh world. He had learned to trust. I had learned to give trust, and together we had emerged from the frozen shadows into a light that promised life, connection, and love. And in the quiet aftermath, as the snow fell softly, blanketing the world in silence, I felt a profound truth settle into my chest. Survival is sacred, trust is fragile, and love, even in its quietest, simplest form, can transform even the coldest, loneliest places. I wrapped him gently in a blanket, holding him close one last time before night claimed the sky completely. He rested against my chest, small breaths slow and even, ears relaxed, tail curling in quiet contentment. Outside, the wind continued its eternal cry, indifferent and relentless. But inside, we had found warmth, we had found trust, we had found each other, and in that we had found life. And as I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of our shared presence fill the cabin, I realized that the story that had begun in frozen shadows under a neglected truck had ended in light, in connection, and in the steady pulse of a heart once abandoned, now unbreakable. LD yet imagine, but both of us would fight to reach.